The year is 1890, and the place the stately home Tenby Croft in Yorkshire, where a group of friends, including the heir to the throne, are gathering for the weekend so they can attend the St Leger Doncaster racecourse. It would end in disaster and ignominy for one of the people involved, a ruined career for another, as well as a lurid court case that gripped all of England. This is the story of the Royal Baccarat scandal. It all began innocently enough in September at the home of 52-year-old Arthur Wilson and his family. He was a millionaire merchant shipping business owner that was based in Hull. He had built the grand mansion in the East Riding of Yorkshire and moved in during the summer of 1876. The scandal started during a house party in September 1890, when Sir William Gordon Cumming was accused of cheating at the card game Baccarat. So who was he? At the time of the events of that weekend, Cumming was a 42-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Scots Guards, having seen active service in South Africa, Egypt and Sudan. In addition to considerable land holdings in Scotland, he owned a house in Belgravia in London, and he was a friend for over 20 years of Edward, Prince of Wales, and would lend it to the prince for assignations with royal mistresses. Daisy Brooke, the prince's mistress at the time, was known to some journalists as Babbling Brooke because of her propensity to gossip. On the 6th of September, Edward had returned early from travelling in Europe and had found Daisy in Cumming's arms, which had soured the relationship between the two men. Cumming had a reputation as a womanizer. He was unmarried at the time of the events and subsequent court case. The Baccarat card game can be played by up to 20 people at a time and uses several decks of cards. There is the banker who often is also the dealer. To win the round, you need to get 9 points from your hand of cards. It was also a form of gambling, and it is said that a player could lose £1,000 in 20 minutes, which is around £128,000 today. The High Court in London had ruled that it was a game of chance rather than skill, and deemed it was illegal to bet money on the outcome of each round. You could only play it for entertainment. But this was no deterrent to the house guests, as the game was played over the long weekend, gambling being the key attraction, which made the participants criminals. The guest list was formidable, and included 49-year-old Edward, the Prince of Wales, later to be Edward VIII, his advisers, Lord Coventry and Lieutenant General Owen Williams. Cumming, a friend of the Prince, was also invited, together with a number of high society notables. On the first night, the guests played Baccarat, and Stanley Wilson thought he saw Cumming cheating and illegally adding to his bet. On the 8th of September, among the 17 evening's players were the Prince, who acted as dealer, Sassoon, who took the part of banker, and Cumming. Sitting next to the latter was Stanley Wilson, who was on Levitt's left. Little did they know that before their stay at the house ended, that they all would be involved in a scandal. As the game began, although many of the inexperienced party were playing for small stakes, Cumming was betting between £5 and £25. Soon after play began, Wilson thought he saw Cumming add 2 red £5 counters onto his stake after the hand had finished, but before the stake had been paid. Later, he thought this had happened a second time. Wilson turned to Levitt, one of the guests, explaining that the man next to me is cheating. After Levitt also watched for a few minutes, he agreed with Wilson. After half an hour, the game was completed and the Prince congratulated Cumming on his play. Wilson and Levitt discussed the cheating. The two men were uncertain what steps to take, and agreed that Wilson would ask his brother-in-law, Lysaght Green, for his advice. Although Green thought it impossible that Cumming would have cheated, Wilson told him that he was certain, as was Levitt. The following day, the 9th of September, the party visited the races, where the Prince's horse won the Clumber Stakes. After dinner, the prince once again wanted to play Baccarat and asked for a chalk line to be drawn on the baize top table, 6 inches from the edge, behind which players were to keep their counters when not placing their stake. Edward was banker, and one of the guests, Williams, acted as the croupier. When Cumming arrived at the table, there were only 2 vacant seats. At either of them, Cumming would be surrounded by members of the Wilson family, all of whom had been informed of the suspicions. After half an hour's play, Lycett Green once again became convinced that Cumming was cheating. He left the table and sent a note to his mother-in-law, who was still at the table, recounting his suspicions. By the time the game was finished, Mary Wilson, the 2 Lycett Greens and Stanley Wilson, all of whom had been watching Cumming closely, were convinced that he had been cheating, although they differed in their versions of what they saw. Others saw nothing, including people sitting closer to him. Over the 2 nights' play, Cumming won a total of £225. Mary Wilson's brother died unexpectedly that night in Hull, so she and her husband did not attend for a second day's racing. They asked all the other guests not to interrupt their plans, and the remainder of the party went to the races and watched the St. Leger. During the journey to the racecourse, Lycett Green asked Edward Somerset for his advice, telling him that several members of the party were convinced of Cumming's guilt, and it was suggested that Lycett Green inform the Prince's senior courtier, Lord Coventry. The men decided that Cumming should sign a document admitting his guilt in exchange for their silence, and Williams and Coventry went to Edward to inform him of what had been happening. The 2 men told the Prince that the evidence they had heard was absolutely conclusive, and they did not believe Sir William Gordon Cumming had a leg to stand on. The Prince believed what he had been told, and also assumed that cheating had taken place. At no point had any of those concerned asked Cumming's side of events. After informing the Prince, the 2 courtiers sought out the accused man and informed him of what had been said, and that the accusation was that he had resorted to foul play at the game. Cumming flatly denied the accusation against him and demanded to see the Prince. Prince Edward pointed out that there were 5 accusers against him. He urged him to sign a document that he would never play cards again in exchange for the silence on the matter from the guests. It had been drafted, and still denying the accusations, Cumming signed the paper without knowing who else would sign it afterwards. It read as follows.
In consideration of the promise made by the gentlemen whose names are subscribed to preserve my silence with reference to an accusation which has been made in regard to my conduct at Baccarat on the nights of Monday and Tuesday, the 8th and 9th at Tranby Croft, I will on my part solemnly undertake never to play cards again as long as I live. Signed, W. Gordon Cumming.
The courtiers took the document to Edward, who summoned the other members of the house. He read the note to them and signed it, as did they all, pointing out to everyone the promise of secrecy was incumbent on all of them. He also added that Cumming was still protesting his innocence, despite signing a document that practically admitted his guilt. It was then signed by those present. Although the Prince hoped that this would bring an end to the affair, it was pointed out that it would not remain secret. It was impossible. Nothing in the world known to 10 people was ever kept secret. Cumming left Tranby Croft early the following morning. This secret was not kept for long, as a fortnight later Cumming was informed by a lady acquaintance that the events at Tranby Croft were being discussed in London society. On the 27th of January, Cumming made a final attempt to have the rumours scotched by instructing his solicitors to write to the 2 Lycett Greens, Stanley Wilson, Levitt and Mary Wilson. It was to demand retraction of the accusation or face a writ for slander. On the 6th of February, with no withdrawal forthcoming, Cumming issued writs against the five through his solicitors, claiming £5,000 damages against each of them. On receipt of the writ, the Wilsons consulted their solicitor George Lewis, who had also acted for the Prince on previous occasions. Lewis briefed Sir Charles Russell to act as counsel for the defence, assisted by Hugh Asquith, the future Liberal Prime Minister. Cumming's solicitors, Wantner and Sons, approached the Solicitor General, Sir Edward Clarke, to act as counsel on his behalf. One of Lewis's early concerns was to ensure Edward did not appear in court. If Cumming could be found guilty by a military tribunal, then the rationale for a civil court case would disappear. Journalists drew their own conclusions from the manoeuvrings by the Prince and his entourage, with the radical press quick to attack the attempts to avoid the scrutiny of a civil court. The Echo wrote that the Baccarat scandal is to be hushed up. It is, no doubt, a very comfortable arrangement for all parties concerned. While the New York Times, normally sympathetic to Edward, foresaw political problems if the trial was prejudiced by such actions. Despite the efforts of the Prince's courtiers to have the matter dealt with by a military court, the case was heard publicly in June 1891. The atmosphere at the trial was described as being like a theatre, and Edward was called as a witness, the first time the heir to the throne had been compelled to appear in court since 1411. Cumming's senior counsel, the Solicitor General Sir Edward Clarke, did not persuade any of the defendants to change their stories, but he highlighted several inaccuracies and serious discrepancies in their evidence. Cumming was replaced in the witness box by the Prince. Examined by Clarke, he stated that he had not seen any cheating and was ignorant of the accusations until he was told by Coventry and Williams. After 20 minutes of questions from both Clarke and Russell, the Prince was free to leave. In comparison with Cumming's performance in the witness box, Edward did not make a strong impression. The reporter for the New York Times noticed that the heir apparent was decidedly fidgety, as he kept changing his position, and that he did not seem able to keep his hands still. Except to those near him, only 2 or 3 of his answers were fairly audible throughout the courtroom. The Daily News agreed, and stated that the impression gained from the Prince's performance was not favourable. Clarke called his last witness, Mr. Williams. Under his questioning, Williams confirmed that he had seen no actions by Cumming that he considered as unfair. After Clarke finished questioning him, Asquith cross-examined the soldier for the remainder of the session. After a brief re-examination by Clarke, the day and the case for the plaintiff came to an end. The third day began with the opening speech for the defendants, after which Stanley Wilson took the stand for the remainder of the day, and on into the fourth day. Examined by Asquith, Stanley recounted seeing Cumming illicitly add counters to his stake twice on the first night, and at least twice on the second night, although he could not remember the full details. When cross-examined by Clarke, he was not browbeaten by the lawyer's questions, although Clarke made him appear brash, conceited and callow. Stanley was replaced in the witness box by Levitt. The Morning Advertiser thought that Levitt felt somewhat uncomfortable appearing against Cumming, and reported that he had described his position as an awkward one. Despite his discomfort, Levitt confirmed that on the first evening he had seen Cumming add counters after the hand had finished, but before the stake had been paid out. He was unsure of other details of the evening's play, and had not witnessed anything on the second night. Lycett Green was followed into the witness box by his wife, and her testimony ran into the following day. Under questioning, she confirmed that she had seldom played baccarat before. Although she had not seen anything untoward on the first night, she accepted her husband's second-hand version of events as the truth, but did not agree that as a result she had been watching Cumming. Although she gave the most important part of her evidence with clarity and conviction, and had impressed the public and press, as she produced a different series of events to those outlined by other witnesses, She stated that she thought she had seen Cumming illicitly add to his stake. On examination by Russell, Mrs. Wilson stated that she thought she saw Cumming cheat twice by adding additional counters to his bet. When Clark cross-examined her, he asked her if anyone had placed a stake of £15. Mrs. Wilson stated that only her husband had placed such an amount, but Wilson had not played on either night, as he disliked both the game and high-stakes gambling. Russell's summing up for the defence took the remainder of the day, and the court adjourned until the following Monday. He referred to a possible 13 acts of cheating that the defendants were alleged to have seen, and that we have 5 people who believe he had cheated and unmistakably saw him cheat, and telling the court how they saw him cheat. He also drew the jury's attention to the gaps in the defendants' memories, where they were so precise about some of their observations, but could not remember other key details. Above all, Clark indicated the defendants, with the exception of Wilson, saw what they had been told to expect. The others were all told there had been cheating, and expected to see it. At the end of his statements, Clark's speech was greeted by applause amongst those in the galleries. The following day, the 9th of June, Russell began his 4-hour summing up. His summary was a response to Clark's, and he went through on a point-by-point basis to discredit the Solicitor General's speech, although in places his description was said at the time was directly contrary to the evidence. Despite a strong and well-regarded closing speech by Clark on Cumming's behalf, the judge's summing up, when made, was described as biased by some. The jury, after deliberating for 15 minutes, found against the lieutenant colonel and in favour of the defendants. After the trial, the prince changed his behaviour to some extent, and although he continued to gamble, he did so in a more discreet manner. He stopped playing baccarat altogether, taking up whist instead. While he was unpopular at the end of the case, it probably did little serious damage to his reputation. Cumming was dismissed from the British Army on the 10th of June 1891, the day after the case closed, and he resigned his membership of his 4 London clubs, the Carlton, Guards, Marlborough and Turf. He was ostracised from society for the rest of his life, even though he had public opinion on his side. The Prince of Wales was now at his most unpopular for a number of years afterwards. Although he offered to break his engagement for a second time, he married his American fiancée the same day. She had stood by him throughout the scandal, and the couple went on to have 5 children together. He retired to his Scottish estate and his property in Dawlish in Devon. He never re-entered society, and the prince declined to meet anyone who henceforth acknowledged the Scottish baronet. None of Cumming's close friends ever spoke to him again, although some relented after Edward's death in 1910, and he remained bitter about the events for the rest of his life. He ran into financial troubles and had to sell his Scottish estate Gordonstoun, which later became a famous private boarding school. He took to heavy drinking, and his marriage was in disarray. He died aged 81 in 1930.